My son stood over me while I lay bleeding on my own hardwood floor and told me that I should have signed the papers when I still had the opportunity. My daughter-in-law stepped right over my legs as she went to get her overnight bag. They locked the front door from the outside, carried their luggage to his truck, and drove 4 hours to a ski resort in Park City, Utah, while I remained on that floor, unable to move, with 3 broken ribs and my left shoulder separated from its socket. What they had no idea about was the second cell phone hidden inside my jacket pocket. The one call I made from that floor did more than keep me alive. It was the first step toward destroying everything they had been trying to build.
My name is Alden Graves. I'm 63 years old, and for 31 years, I built a commercial real estate appraisal company in Columbus, Ohio. I started in a tiny one-room office above a dry cleaner and eventually turned it into a business with 4 branches and 14 staff appraisers. 2 years ago, I sold the company. The final wire transfer reached my account on a Tuesday morning in October. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, thinking about all the years I had invested in that business. I thought about the early mornings, the canceled vacations, the birthdays I had missed, and the school plays I never got to see because I was working. I was proud of what I had built. At the same time, I was completely worn out.
I had plans for the next part of my life. I wanted to travel. I thought about buying a small lake house somewhere in northern Michigan. I imagined spending quiet mornings fishing and my evenings sitting by the window with a good book. For the first time in decades, my schedule would belong entirely to me. That was my plan. My son had another plan. He and his wife had been married for 4 years when she became pregnant with their first child. They told me the house they were renting in Westerville was getting too cramped. Daycare expenses were becoming harder to manage, and they said it would make much more sense if they moved into my 4-bedroom home in Bexley for a short time. They promised it would only be temporary. They said they would save money, build up a down payment, and eventually buy a house of their own. I agreed. That was 18 months ago. The baby was born, and before long, my son and his wife had completely settled into my master bedroom as if it had always belonged to them. I moved myself into the guest bedroom down the hall. I told myself that it was okay. This was family. This was what fathers were supposed to do for their children. But during those 18 months, I began noticing things.
My son stopped talking about saving for a down payment. My daughter-in-law remodeled parts of my kitchen and installed appliances I had never bought. Later, I discovered she had charged them to a store account opened in my name without asking me. When I confronted them about it, my son simply smiled and told me not to worry so much about money at my age. He said stress was especially bad for older men. That was the first time he called me an older man. I was 62. I had spent decades running a company. I was still healthy, I had a full head of hair, and my doctor had told me my blood pressure was practically textbook perfect. But from that moment on, something changed in the way they treated me. They began treating me like I was a problem they needed to manage. It started with little things. My daughter-in-law began sorting my medications into one of those plastic pill organizers, divided by days of the week. I had never asked her to do it. She left it sitting right in the middle of the kitchen counter, where anyone entering the house could see it. She wanted people to notice. She wanted them to form an opinion about me before I ever had the chance to explain myself. My son started speaking for me at family gatherings. If someone asked me a question, he would answer before I could. He would finish my sentences, laugh in a friendly way, and casually mention that I had been getting a little forgetful lately. Sometimes, when he thought I was not looking, he would tap 2 fingers against his temple. I was always looking. They needed everyone around us to believe that I was losing my ability to think clearly. They needed that story to become accepted as fact because they were preparing for something much bigger. Then came the folder. My son brought it to the dining room table one Sunday night after dinner. It was an ordinary manila folder, the kind you can buy in a large pack at any office supply store. But the papers inside were anything but ordinary. There were 3 documents. The first was a durable financial power of attorney. It had already been printed and dated. At the bottom was a signature line, and beneath it, my name was already typed. The second was a medical power of attorney in almost exactly the same format. The third was a quitclaim deed that would transfer ownership of my house directly to my son. He pushed the folder across the table toward me. He told me it was just paperwork. According to him, every financial advisor recommended that seniors have these documents prepared. He said it was normal and that I was thinking too much about it. I asked him who had told him that I needed a financial advisor. He and my daughter-in-law exchanged a quick glance. It lasted less than a second. They probably believed I had not noticed. I had. I told them both that I already had a corporate attorney I had worked with for more than 2 decades.
If I ever needed estate planning documents or any other legal paperwork, that attorney would be the person preparing and reviewing them. I told them I was not signing anything that night. I also told them I would not sign anything in the future without my attorney examining it first. My daughter-in-law leaned toward me and spoke in that soft, careful voice people use when they are pretending to be reasonable. She said attorneys were expensive. She suggested that maybe I was becoming paranoid. My son then put his hand on my arm, almost like he was calming down an upset child in a parking lot. That was when I stood up. I left the table without another word. For the next 3 days, the atmosphere inside the house was difficult to describe. There was no screaming. There were no obvious threats. Instead, there was pressure. Quiet, controlled pressure. They were polite in the way people become polite when they are waiting for someone to finally surrender. Then, on Wednesday evening, my son came into my study while I was reviewing my own financial record. I had printed 4 months of bank statements. What I found made my stomach tighten. There were 6 wire transfers from my checking account over a period of 11 weeks. Each transfer was between $12,000 and $18,000. Every transaction had been authorized through my online banking account. The money had been sent to an account I did not recognize. Someone had accessed my banking profile. Someone had moved more than $80,000 out of my account while I was sleeping in the guest bedroom of my own house. I had the statements spread across my desk when my son entered the study. He looked down at the papers. There was no guilt on his face. There was calculation. I asked him to explain the transfers. He told me the money had been used for home maintenance and capital improvements. He said I had approved every transaction myself during one of my confused episodes. According to him, I simply did not remember. He told me that this was how things worked now. Then he said that he and his wife had been quietly protecting me for months. He delivered the explanation as though he had rehearsed it many times. I told him I had never experienced a confused spell in my life. His voice immediately became louder. He called me defensive. He called me irrational. Then he said that my behavior was exactly why they needed the power of attorney. He said they needed legal protection because they were living with someone who could no longer manage his own financial affairs. He moved closer to the desk and reached for the bank statements. He told me I was getting worked up over nothing. I pulled the papers away. That was when he grabbed both sides of my jacket. He was not, at least at first, trying to injure me. He wanted the documents. I pulled backward. He pushed forward. The corner of my oak desk slammed into my lower back with the force of a hammer. I fell sideways. My shoulder struck the edge of the filing cabinet before I crashed onto the hardwood floor. The pain was immediate. There was no gradual buildup. 1 second, I was standing. The next second, I was on the floor, unable to move. I tried to breathe and discovered I could not take a full breath. My son stood above me with the bank statements in his hands. His wife appeared in the doorway behind him. She looked down at me. Then she looked at her husband. Then she said quietly that maybe this was better anyway. She said that a fall like that, at my age, would need to be documented. My son straightened his shirt. Then he told me that once I was ready to sign the papers like a reasonable adult, they would take me to the emergency room. Until then, he said, I could stay exactly where I was and think about what I really wanted the next chapter of my life to look like. He took the bank statements. My daughter-in-law closed the study door. Then I heard the deadbolt click from the outside. I had installed that lock years earlier because I wanted to secure the study whenever I traveled. They had just used it to trap me inside. I lay there on the hardwood floor and listened to them moving around the house. I heard drawers opening. I heard bags being packed. I heard footsteps moving from room to room. Then I heard my son's truck start outside. A few moments later, the engine faded into the distance. I reached inside the hidden pocket of my jacket. My fingers found the second phone. They had not known about it. I did not call 911. Not yet. There was another call I needed to make first. Crawford answered on the second ring. He was my attorney. He was a precise, quiet, almost unreadable man who had worked with me since the day I incorporated my appraisal company. He knew practically every part of my financial life. He also knew about the part my son had never seen. I told him what had happened. I spoke slowly because every word sent pain through my back and ribs. I told him to activate the arrangement we had quietly established 14 months earlier. That arrangement had been put in place long before my son and his wife had moved into my house. It had been created back when I first started to suspect that their temporary stay might not remain temporary. Here is what my son never knew. 14 months earlier, When I first noticed the pill organizer sitting in plain sight on the kitchen counter, and when I first noticed my son answering questions for me at Christmas, I had done what I had always done whenever I sensed a business deal starting to go wrong. I protected myself. I met with Crawford. Together, we transferred my home into an irrevocable living trust controlled by Crawford's firm. On paper, I no longer owned the house personally. The trust did. That meant the quitclaim deed my son wanted me to sign was worthless. There was nothing left for me to transfer to him. But that was not the only protection I had put in place. 3 years earlier, my son's commercial landscaping company had been drowning in debt. He came to me privately. He was embarrassed. He told me he was close to losing everything. He needed money. I helped him the way fathers sometimes help their sons. But I did it secretly. I knew that if my son understood the money was coming directly from me, he might feel like he owed me something. I did not want him carrying that resentment. So Crawford and I created a small Delaware LLC called Ridgeline Capital Holdings. Ridgeline invested $400,000 into my son's company as a private equity investment. My son believed an outside investor had recognized his talent and believed in the future of his business. I remember watching him stand in my kitchen and proudly tell his wife about the deal. He talked about leverage. He talked about growth. He talked about his company's trajectory. I sat there, drinking my coffee, and said nothing. The investment agreement had a clause buried on page 19. It looked like ordinary legal language. It was not. It was a moral conduct and duty of care provision. Under that clause, if the primary beneficiary of the capital was found to have committed financial fraud, elder financial exploitation, or abuse against a family member, Ridgeline Capital Holdings had the unilateral right to demand repayment of the entire investment. It could also freeze all business accounts and seize collateral assets within 48 hours. No board vote was necessary. No committee had to approve it. One signature from Ridgeline's managing member was enough. That managing member was me. My son had signed the agreement 3 years earlier. He had apparently read the dollar amount at the top and little else. I told Crawford to pull the lever. Then I called 911. The paramedics arrived 18 minutes later. They had to break the deadbolt to get into the study. By the time they reached me, I had 3 fractured ribs, a separated left shoulder, and serious soft tissue damage along my lower spine. One of the female EMTs told me that I was lucky I had remained conscious. I told her I knew. I meant more than she understood. The next morning, a detective came to the hospital. He was careful. He was the kind of investigator who asks the same question 3 different ways, just to see whether the answer changes. He had already read the incident report. He knew the deadbolt had been engaged from the outside. He asked who else had been inside the house that evening. I told him I had been alone. I told him I had fallen from my office chair, hit the desk, and landed hard. I told him my son and daughter-in-law had gone away for a long weekend, and that I did not want to interrupt their trip over what I described as a stupid accident. The detective looked at me for several seconds. He did not believe me. He was right, but without my cooperation, he did not have enough to move forward. Before leaving, he gave me his card. He told me to call him when my memory became clearer. I placed the card underneath my pillow. 2 days later, my son and daughter-in-law walked into my hospital room. My son was carrying flowers from the gift shop downstairs. My daughter-in-law had one hand pressed against her chest. She had the exact expression of a woman who had spent the entire drive from Utah practicing what she would say when she arrived. She told me how frightened she had been when the hospital called. She said they had turned around immediately. She said she had barely been able to breathe after hearing the word hospital. I said nothing. I simply watched her perform. The moment the nurse left the room, the performance disappeared. My daughter-in-law placed the flowers on the windowsill without even putting them into water. Then she reached into her bag. She pulled out the manila folder. The same folder. The same quitclaim deed. The same 2 powers of attorney. But there was something new. She had added another document. She told me it was a voluntary admission form for an assisted living facility in Gahanna called Willowgate Gardens. She said it was a highly respected place. My son stood at the end of the bed with his arms crossed. He told me the doctors had confirmed that my injuries were consistent with a fall. He said a man my age, living alone, without supervision, was a danger to himself. Then he told me that the simplest way forward was for me to sign the papers immediately and let them handle everything properly. I looked at my son for a long time. Then I reached for the pen. I signed every document, every page. My hand shook slightly. Part of that was because the pain in my shoulder was very real, but part of it was because I was looking at my son and grieving the person I thought he had been. When I finished the final signature, I allowed the pen to slip from my fingers. It rolled across the tray table and dropped onto the floor. My daughter-in-law immediately picked up the documents. She held them with both hands as though they were something delicate and incredibly valuable. She checked each signature carefully. I watched her face. Relief appeared first, then triumph, then calculation. All three emotions passed across her face in less than 4 seconds. She closed the folder. My son looked at her. She gave him a small nod. Neither of them realized that I had just given them exactly what they wanted, and neither of them understood that the signatures they were celebrating would soon become the evidence that helped bring everything they had planned crashing down. He would figure it out soon enough. I was discharged from the hospital the next morning and transferred to a private rehabilitation facility without my son's knowledge. At Crawford's instruction, my location was completely blocked from disclosure. When my daughter-in-law called the hospital to confirm my Thursday morning transfer to Willowgate, the administrative coordinator spoke to her with calm, professional detachment. She told her that I was no longer a patient there, that my medical power of attorney had been formally revoked, and that no additional information could be released to her. She called Crawford's office almost immediately. His assistant told her that he was unavailable and that there was nothing further they could discuss with her. My son spent the next 2 days trying to gain access to his business accounts from every device he owned. He tried his office computer, he tried his phone, he tried another laptop, he tried every method he thought might still work, but one by one, every door was closing in front of him. Eventually, he managed to reach a senior commercial accounts manager at his bank. The manager did not raise his voice or sound angry. He simply read from the legal injunction that had been filed that morning by Ridgeline Capital Holdings in a flat, careful, almost emotionless voice. The manager informed my son that a Level 4 contract breach had been triggered under the moral conduct clause of his original investment agreement. The breach cited an active county investigation involving elder financial exploitation and documented abuse of a dependent family member. Because of that breach, all operating assets were now subject to full seizure and clawback against the original $400,000 investment. My son listened without interrupting. He knew what the words meant. He knew that this was no longer something he could explain away as a family argument or a misunderstanding inside our home. The situation had moved into a world where documents, signatures, bank records, and legal orders mattered more than excuses. After the manager finished explaining the situation, my son asked him a question in a very quiet voice. He asked whether the beneficial owner of Ridgeline Capital Holdings was a resident of Ohio. The manager paused. Then he told my son that he was not authorized to confirm that information. My son already knew the answer. I could hear it in the silence that followed. There are moments when a person does not need to say what they understand. Sometimes the silence itself says everything. My son had spent days trying to figure out who had stepped into the situation, who had the resources to move against him, and who had somehow known enough about what was happening to shut down the financial machinery he depended on. By then, he had probably started putting the pieces together. The next thing that happened came on a Saturday morning at exactly 9 a.m. A process server came to my front door. He was carrying an envelope addressed to my son. He handed it over without drama and without explanation. The envelope contained a formal 72-hour eviction notice from the Graves Family Irrevocable Trust. The notice demanded that all non-owner occupants vacate the property by Tuesday at noon or face removal through lawful action by law enforcement. My son stood there holding the papers, probably still believing there was some way to stop what was happening. There was more inside the envelope. Attached to the eviction notice was a second document. It was a criminal referral filed with the Columbus Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. The referral detailed $80,000 in unauthorized wire transfers from my personal bank account. It was supported by digital access logs and time-stamped authentication information. Those records showed that someone had accessed my online banking account from a device registered to my daughter-in-law's email address. That was not an accusation based on someone's memory. It was not a story that could be argued over at the dinner table. It was a trail. There were dates, there were times, there were records, there was information showing where the access came from and when it happened. The kind of information my son could not simply explain away by saying that everyone had misunderstood him. My son called me 40 times that Saturday. I did not answer the first call. I did not answer the second. I let the phone continue ringing through the afternoon while I sat quietly and thought about everything that had happened. By the time the phone rang for the 41st time, I decided to answer. He did not yell. That surprised me. He spoke quietly, and somehow that told me more than shouting ever could have. His voice sounded tired. There was fear in it. There was uncertainty, too. He told me that he knew I was behind Ridgeline. He said he finally understood that things had gone too far. He said he knew that what had happened could not simply be erased. Then he told me he was sorry. His voice carried just enough weight that another man, a different man, a man who had never lain alone on his own study floor listening to a truck pull away from his house, might have been deeply moved by those words. I believed that he was sorry. I told him I did not tell him that everything was going to be okay. I did not tell him that I forgave him. I told him that I believed he was sorry. There is a difference. Then I told him something else. I said that being sorry did not move $80,000 back into my bank account. Being sorry did not undo the transfers. Being sorry did not erase the records. Being sorry did not unlock a deadbolt. Being sorry did not change what his wife had said while I was lying helplessly on the floor. There was a long pause. Then I asked him if he remembered what his wife had said while I was lying there. He went completely quiet. I could almost picture him standing somewhere in that house with the phone pressed against his ear, trying to remember the exact words, trying to understand how much I had heard, and wondering what else I might know. I let the silence remain for a few seconds. Then I told him the truth. I had installed a home security system with audio-enabled cameras in every room of that house during the same week he and his wife moved in. I had not done it because I was paranoid. I had done it because I was experienced. There is a difference between fear and preparation. I had spent 31 years in a business where documentation was everything. Every agreement mattered. Every transaction had to be recorded. Every decision had to be supported. When something went wrong, people did not ask what you thought had happened. They asked what you could prove had happened. I had learned that lesson early in my career. The only version of events that truly matters is the version you can prove. My son did not say anything, so I continued. I told him that Crawford had already forwarded a full copy of the Wednesday evening audio recording to the financial crimes detective assigned to the case. I did not describe the recording to him. I did not need to. He knew exactly which conversation I meant. He knew what his wife had said. He knew what had happened that evening. And for the first time, I think he understood that I had not been helpless just because I had been lying on that floor. I had been listening. I had been documenting. And I had been preparing. The call ended there. There was no dramatic goodbye. There was no screaming match. There was no final speech. The line simply went quiet. 4 months later, I sat in a hard wooden chair inside Franklin County Common Pleas Court and watched my son walk into the courtroom. I remember the sound of his shoes against the floor. I remember how small the courtroom seemed compared with everything that had happened outside of it. Most of all, I remember looking at him and realizing that I was looking at two people at the same time. I was looking at the man standing in front of the judge, but I was also looking at the little boy I had once carried in my arms. Those two images existed in my mind at the same time, and neither one erased the other. My son entered a guilty plea to 1 count of unauthorized use of financial resources and 1 count of elder financial exploitation. The judge sentenced him to 18 months of supervised probation. He was ordered to pay full restitution of $80,000. He was also ordered to complete 200 hours of community service. And there was another condition that mattered to me more than I expected. He was barred from holding financial power of attorney over any person for a period of 10 years. 10 years. For someone who had once been trusted with my finances, my home, and my future, that number carried a strange kind of finality. My daughter-in-law also entered a plea. She pleaded to a single count of theft by deception, involving the store account she had opened in my name without my authorization. Her sentence included 60 hours of community service and full restitution. When the hearing was over, Crawford spoke to me. He told me that the audio recording had given the prosecution grounds to pursue significantly stronger charges. I already knew what he meant. There was enough information there to make the case much worse. There were options that could have resulted in additional charges and much more serious consequences, but I had asked them not to pursue those charges. That decision was mine. No one made it for me. Crawford respected it. The prosecution respected it. And I have made my peace with that choice. People sometimes think that justice always means using every possible weapon against the person who hurt you. I do not believe that anymore. Sometimes justice means stopping the harm. Sometimes it means getting your money back. Sometimes it means making sure the person cannot hurt another vulnerable person in the same way. And sometimes it means deciding for yourself where the punishment should end. I had spent enough time watching my family turn into a courtroom. I did not want the rest of my life to become another extension of it. 3 weeks after the eviction was enforced, I moved back into my house in Bexley. I remember opening the front door. For a moment, I just stood there. The house looked almost exactly as I remembered it, but it did not feel the same. Then I went into the master bedroom and opened every window. It was November. The air outside was cold. I stood there and let the November air move through the room until the house began to smell like mine again. That mattered to me. It sounds like a small thing now, but at the time, it felt important. The air coming through those windows felt like proof that the house belonged to me again. Not because a document said so, not because someone else had been removed, because I could finally stand there without feeling like a stranger in my own home. I have not spoken to my son since the sentencing. That door is not permanently closed. I want to be clear about that. I have known him since he was small enough to fit inside the crook of my arm. I remember holding him. I remember his first steps. I remember the years when he needed me for everything. I remember teaching him things. I remember watching him become a man. Those memories did not disappear because of what happened. But I have learned something at 63 years old that I wish I had understood much earlier. Love is not the same thing as trust, and forgiveness is not the same thing as access. You can love someone and still refuse to give them the keys to your life. You can forgive someone and still decide that they cannot manage your money. You can remember every good thing about a person and still recognize that they did something deeply wrong. Those truths can exist together. One does not erase the other. Maybe one day, if my son does the work that needs to be done, we will talk. I do not mean saying the right words. I do not mean sending a letter full of apologies. I do not mean asking me to forget. I mean doing the work, taking responsibility, living with the consequences, proving through actions over time that he understands what he did and why it was wrong. Maybe then we will sit across from each other again. Maybe then I will hear his voice without hearing the past behind it. But today is not that day. Today, I am allowed to live. I sleep in my own room now. I wake up when I want to. I drink my own coffee. I sit at my own kitchen table. I decide who comes through my front door. I decide who gets information about my life. And I do not share my passwords with anyone on this earth except Crawford. That may sound extreme to some people. To me, it sounds like experience. I used to think that trust meant giving someone access. Now, I understand that real trust has to be earned, protected, and respected. I am not interested in being afraid anymore. I am interested in being careful. There is a difference. The lake house in Michigan is still on the list. I have not forgotten about it. Some mornings, I sit at my kitchen table with my coffee and think about what it might feel like to wake up somewhere quiet. No phone ringing every few minutes. No one asking me for passwords. No one telling me what I supposedly owe them. No one standing outside my bedroom door. No one making plans for my money while I am still alive to object. Just water, trees, cold morning air, a quiet room, a place where I can look out at the lake and know that whatever happens next is mine to decide. Some mornings, I imagine sitting there with a cup of coffee and watching the sunlight move across the water. I think about how different that kind of silence would feel. Not the silence of fear, not the silence that comes after someone has hurt you, a peaceful silence. The kind where nothing is waiting to happen. I think I will find out soon enough. But first, I had to make sure the monsters were gone, and they are. They are gone from my house. They are gone from my accounts. They are gone from my passwords. They are gone from the decisions that belong to me. For a long time, I thought getting them out would be the hardest part. It was not. The hardest part was accepting that the people I had loved and trusted could become the people I needed protection from. That took longer, but I understand it now. I understand that protecting yourself does not make you cruel. Setting boundaries does not make you heartless. Refusing to hand someone another opportunity to hurt you does not mean you never loved them. Sometimes, protecting what remains of your life is the most responsible thing you can do. So I wake up every morning in my own room. I walk into my own kitchen. I make my own coffee. I open my own windows and I breathe. The house is quiet. The locks work. The accounts are mine. The decisions are mine. And for the first time in a long time, I am not waiting for someone else to decide what happens to me. I already decided. I chose myself. And this time, I am going to keep choosing myself.